the RSNA, this is the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast. My name is Paul Yi, and I'm a radiologist at the University of Maryland and co-host of the podcast.
And my name is Ali Tejani, and I'm a radiology resident at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center and co-host of the podcast. Each month, we dive into the hottest topics in radiology AI and talk with leading experts, thought leaders, and movers and shakers in the field. Welcome back to the Radiology AI Podcast. It's time for the second part of our conversation with Dr. Florence Doo about sustainability in radiology and AI. Florence is Director of Innovation at the University of Maryland Medical Intelligent Imaging Center and Assistant Professor in the Abdominal Division at the Department of Radiology and Nuclear Medicine at University of Maryland, Baltimore. She completed her radiology residency at Mount Sinai West with dual fellowships in body imaging at Stanford University and imaging informatics at the American College of Radiology. Dr. Doo's expertise and publication record span body imaging, artificial intelligence, health equity, and entrepreneurship. She is also a recipient of the AUR General Electric Radiology Research Fellowship Grant to pursue research in radiology AI, cloud services, equitable health delivery, and environmental sustainability. You know, I gotta say, I think when we think about AI workflow, we don't necessarily think about sustainability right at the top of our mind. We don't think about, okay, here are the sources that are contributing to increased greenhouse gas contribution. Here's a step that I may take that can worsen my carbon footprint. We think about, okay, what compute is available to me, right? How can I get this model, if we're developing tools, model trained and tested and created quickly and deployed quickly? So when we think about that, I remember when we first started working with large language models, which it's not a long time ago, right? You think about many of our readers will be familiar with before ChatGPT, BERT or Roberta or DBERTA, some of these other large language models. There was a budding conversation at the time, and just in a few papers, about how developing these models de novo actually created a large carbon footprint. And there wasn't much attention on, pun intended. But now it seems like this is the right time. There's increased attention to large language models, both in radiology and outside of medicine. Do you see any multidisciplinary conversation in multiple fields that are interested in AI to address these issues, where we could work together? Are you feeling more of an initiative that's driven by your work, where you're really kind of raising the flag here and reminding everyone that, hey, we have to be conscious about these decisions, about how we proceed in terms of creating the model, in terms of storing data? What's your experience been?
I think what you're pointing out here is a couple things. And actually, it's fascinating to me because I think you pointed out that people just want to deploy the models, deploy them quickly. And that on its own is an efficiency step, which is a climate change question. And I think, interestingly, even NeurIPS conferences have mentioned before, right? It was only recently, even a couple of years ago, that they started thinking about why is it that we report all this accuracy on these models, but not the efficiency or the speed of how it's deployed. And I'm sure nobody wants to sit on a loading Google page for over a minute until something loads. And even with LLMs being deployed, people are waiting for the response to come back. And so computer scientists at the most basic science aspect of computer science, right, going into developing their code and making it more efficient, that's already being a very interesting and wide open field for people to explore. And a separate thing about the multidisciplinary aspect of climate change and how do we do that as radiology AI scientists and people who implement these tools, that's something that we should think about, because not just, how are we going to contribute to the carbon footprint, but hey, is this going to save me money, right? If it's going to run forever and it's going to cost me all this energy to do, I'm sure our electric bills are not small in doing that. And even if we don't think about it, the vendors who may be purchasing energy and doing this across data centers, they're definitely thinking about it. And I think that's why there's so much interest is there's not just the, we're contributing to climate change, but really it's a financial problem. It's also a sustainability problem for the system to say, if we select the wrong vendor or somebody who's not efficient, how much slower are our processes, and how much more is this going to cost me? And I'm sure all of us know, right, if we live near a huge trash dump or if we live near a chemical plant, but we should also now consider, are we living near data centers that are sucking out tons of energy, right? And also draining water and resources that would otherwise be used for other purposes. And I think that's becoming a global conversation as well, because most of the data centers now are located in the US, for example. And there's other places, and there's a whole conversation we can have about colonization of the new digital world and how we're placing things in places and kind of thinking about sustainability on a more global scale. But yeah, getting back to your original question, I think there's a lot of room for multidisciplinary interactions, and there's so many researchers. I think we're starting to see how healthcare and healthcare scientists such as ourselves and healthcare delivery folks are really thinking about how does this apply, right? How does all this interconnect? I think that like a large, sparsely attenuated model would be way more carbon intense, but it's actually like a densely attenuated model. So it's actually really interesting to think about which type of models would you select if you were to develop something. And it's the equivalent of saying, I want to use a hammer versus a sledgehammer for a nail. And it's a really different process when you think about how do you solve a problem.
It was really interesting when you talked about water use. When I think about emissions and carbon footprint and energy consumption, I'm thinking often like, oh, well, how many GPUs are we running? What are we using to power our computers? But the cooling is kind of crazy. I recall there's this like bombshell of a news article where Google, I think they use like over 1 billion gallons of water in just like a single state to cool its data centers in a given year. That's just crazy, right? Like it's like the entire, well, I don't know, maybe I would imagine it's like all that you have in like the Hoover Dam. And so it's kind of crazy. There's so many sources that can be overlooked or insidious. So I'm curious, what are sources of these carbon emissions or greenhouse gases or contributors to climate change in AI workflows?
That's such a great question. And I would say there's so many things, right? So again, this goes back to the different scopes and how we consider what is involved, right, with that kind of energy use. And I'm saying energy very loosely because energy actually, like I said, was a scope 2 emission, right? Energy that contributes to everything else. Scope 1 would be direct, and then scope 3 is the indirects. So when we think about the indirects, let's go upstream, right? So we're thinking of, even with the GPU centers, how we manufacture and then transport those GPUs to wherever they're going, building the HVAC systems that go around them, and all the raw material extractions that may be involved with building those things, right? There's a whole shortage of different parts that go into the machines. So all that is scope 3, but related. And then directly, the data center itself, and again, is that a direct versus an indirect, right? In building the center. Is the generator that's powering all that, that's probably a direct thing. The warehousing that goes around all those other materials, is that direct? And also then the downstream of that, of the disposal and the renewal, and can you do a circular economy kind of thing and reuse some of those materials? So all of that is involved in the conversation about what is our contribution. And that's just one piece of what you were asking. And it just boggles my mind. I think, again, about being very definitive about what goes into those different scopes really changes the whole conversation. And, who's doing it? If Microsoft's doing it versus I'm doing it, I'm probably going to be doing different things.
When you attend RSNA 2023, our industry influencers and radiology trailblazers are set to help you embrace what's next in medical imaging. Imagine what new medical imaging practices and technology can teach about collaboration and innovation. We have everything you need, all in one place, as we help you explore how to lead through change. Join us November 26th through the 30th for the biggest week in radiology, in person, virtually, or both. Early bird pricing is available through October 4th. Register now for RSNA 2023 at rsna.org/register. I remember, Flo, when you first told me about the protocol standard framework, and I hadn't heard of it, and it made a lot of sense because it seems to simplify what could be a really complex topic when you're trying to develop sustainable practice or initiatives. Do you think there's a role for, not to simplify it too much, but like a score sheet, right? Or a way of grading initiatives, saying here's problems that this initiative addresses, the direct component, the indirect, maybe both. Is that a proposed way to get feedback on how efficient and how effective your sustainability practices are?
I think that would be an amazing paper to write together. So let's think about that. But also separately, it's so fascinating because every other industry, it's a requirement, right? It's required by the US government to report these things in these different scopes in order to continue being a business. And surprisingly, it's not, though, in the healthcare industry. So the Joint Commission, they had an originally proposed set of guidelines and they made this kind of reporting mandatory, but then they just changed it and said it was optional. And so there's this whole New England Journal of Medicine article, or also a GEM article that you can read about the fact that it should be mandatory and they should report these things. I think this kind of thing, some things you can't really solve with regulations, but in this specific case, I think it's really important to have those regulations, to kind of have those standards and kind of develop almost an Energy Star rating, right, for systems to really see how they're doing and kind of benchmark themselves. So yes, I do think that it would be great to come up with some kind of scorecard and maybe kind of push for that across the field.
I love that Energy Star ratings for models. I mean, I could totally see vendors, right, having a little verified sticker or some sort of logo on their promotional material now, right, saying that, hey, we're conscious. We take the right steps here to ensure that you're guilt free when using our model. That's great.
Right, exactly. And it would be really great to write a paper about it, do the science behind it, kind of develop and evaluate, how efficient is it? What kind of metrics do we like to see? All of that.
So I think the idea of an Energy Star rating is really intriguing. And it makes me wonder who really led the initiative there. Was it government? Was it industry? Was it some environmental group? So I'm wondering, what about for AI and radiology general? Who do you think will lead adoption of sustainable practices? Is it going to be the academic departments? Is it going to be private practice? Is it going to be vendors maybe, or is it going to be government?
I it's one of those things that I almost feel like if you create a measurement that makes sense, people will value it. I think that's the creation of value that's really central to how I think about things, right? I think labs like Yumi, right, that will really do that science to kind of create those metrics and think deeply about it and just kind of say, hey, we've interrogated this, we've thought about it, we're going to go chat about it at RSNA with leaders across different hospital departments and having these conversations across all these different areas, kind of building on that and really saying, hey, we've got this measurement. Here's how we can apply it across these different AI tools or other energy using type things, and saying, if we had this measurement and we are going to stick it on these things and say, hey, across all radiology departments, we're agreeing to use it, then do vendors think that that's valuable? People who are purchasing it, do they find it usable, right? Is it something that we can say, this is financially feasible? This is something that we all want. And I think people wanting it, again, phrasing it in terms of what people are actually wanting and what they're demanding. If I was going out and shopping for, I don't know, a refrigerator and it had no Energy Star label on it, I would just kind of frown at it nowadays. I don't know if that's how you think, but that's something that I'm consciously looking for. And I think if we start having and encouraging that use, saying, hey, early adopters, this is a free tool and please put it on your thing. Ones who aren't using it, I think will start noticing that. And I think it's one of the things we can develop together. If we're really interested as a community that this is something that we want and we value, we can communicate that to each other, vendors and radiologists alike who are thinking about this very deeply.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what's made me change some of my practices. And it might sound silly, but my local electric company, they have this email every week that basically says, how much energy did you use compared to last week? And where are you in relation to your neighbors? And it makes me always happy to see that I'm on the more efficient side of things. So I wonder if we could do a similar thing where we get some gamification and some competition going on.
That sounds fun. We should add it to the table.
I think that's, there's a dual role there too, because what you're doing is you're bringing it to your attention, right? You're forcing it exactly where you're going to see it in your inbox, right, with your emails. So if you bring it to the front of social media account or whatever you're using on a daily basis, right, you're going to be forced to see your usage. And, that you're more likely to hopefully think about it that way too, just like a sticker, right, on a device. And I think that what we're doing here, I think it's grassroots, right? We're telling our listeners that, hey, we'd love to have more conversations about this. I'm sure many of our listeners feel the same way, or they've done research in this area, or they're thinking about it, or they're actively engaged right now in developing projects. But what are some immediate next steps, right, that we can recommend, or maybe that you recommend? And they don't have to be large scale, right? Anything that you think our listeners can do to be more conscious or to spread the word. Any thoughts on that?
I think the general advice is kind of like looking at your local community and saying, what's being done in my department? What can I do from a life cycle analysis standpoint, energy standpoint, financial standpoint, and just saying, where are we at, benchmarking it, and kind of thinking of a small project and moving forward with it. That's kind of step one. But also, another step is what you just mentioned, having conversations, even locally or here on the podcast or at conferences and beyond. I think creating those conversations and having them is really important. And beyond that, there's the sky's the limit. There's so much to do, and there's so many projects that I would love to collaborate on, and we're already working together on. So I think it's going to be really great to see what happens in the future.
So, Flo, I think it's safe to say that neither myself nor Ali are climate science experts. So, in light of that, is there anything that we haven't asked you that you think would be beneficial for our listeners to learn about this topic?
Sure. I know that this podcast is typically focused on artificial intelligence specifically, but one of the things that I think is really important now as radiologists is to think about the health outcomes of what we're doing. And I think this is one of the things that's not touched upon quite enough. And with increasing changes in the climate, right, there's things that the climate does to how we practice. For example, with energy shortages in certain states where all of a sudden their internet's not working or computers aren't working, that creates unique workforce challenges that we haven't addressed. And technology really can help us and kind of predict the future. I think there's a lot there to think about. And I really hope, the listeners can also consider artificial intelligence beyond just segmentation or classification or large language models, but really going beyond and saying, how do we take population level, workforce level type things and saying, how do we change the future and make everything more sustainable?
Yeah, I think that's a good word. A lot to look forward to. A lot of exciting things going on in the pipeline.
I'm just excited to learn. I can't wait to see what we do next in this front, and hopefully translating that to our practice sooner than later is the goal, right? Flo, I think on behalf of Paul, myself, and our listeners, thank you so much for your time and expertise. I think this conversation could go on for at least another 30 minutes, if not an hour or so. And again, so much to learn from you and your experiences. And we're all looking forward to seeing the next steps and how this manifests. So thanks again for your time, and our listeners. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we'll see you next time on the Radiology AI podcast.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. We hope you enjoyed the conversation just as much as we did.
Subscribe to the Radiology Artificial Intelligence podcast for more discussion on content from the journal and hot topics in our field. Thanks again to all our panelists involved in the conversation.
We hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Radiology Artificial Intelligence podcast. Shout out to Uriah Shemchison for our podcast music and to the RSNA podcast staff.
Email us at podcast@rsna.org anytime with questions, feedback, or suggestions.